Now, as they say, for something completely different. But very Veliokovsky. I'm going back to Ages in Chaos, and particularly Ramesses II and his time. I expect some of you have been following the discussions we've had in review over the last year or two on the subject of the Battle of Kadesh. And the reason we've been kicking that around is looking more closely at Veliokovsky's suggestion in Ramesses II in his time that the Battle of Kadesh, which was fought between the Egyptians and a Hittite coalition, was actually the same as a battle hundreds and hundreds of years later fought between the Egyptians and the Babylonians at Carchemish. Veliokovsky's reconstruction involves a massive shift in Egyptian and Hittite history. If the Battle of Kadesh is the same as the Battle of Carchemish, then instead of Kadesh happening around 1250 BC, it has to happen at 605 BC because there's pretty good dates by the time you come down to the first millennium. So Veliokovsky was arguing for a shift of 670 years. And I have to say, one of the reasons I've looked in detail at this is probably of all the stuff that Veliokovsky wrote on ancient history, this is the least palatable. Ages in Chaos Volume 1 was taken, got a very good reception, and even when he produced Peoples of the Sea, even that was a big move, but a lot of revisionists and SIS members, things like that, still were convinced. But once he came to moving this, it really did look a step too far. And that's one reason I've looked at it quite a bit over the years. As I said, we've got a debate that's been going on about the battle. And arguments about could Veliokovsky have been right. In one of the review forum issues, we discussed the battle, and there are lots of issues that don't seem to fit very well in the Egyptian story. And then in a further piece in review, we went a bit further and we looked not just at the battle, but the years just after. Because if you put these, one battle here and one coming down hundreds of years, if you put them together, that must mean that ensuing histories must tie up as well. And we saw in this second one that a few years just after, they could fit quite well. But what I want to do today is apply what I think is a much more rigorous test. If we go on a few decades, do the histories clash? You know, if we're right, or Veliokovsky was right about putting these two battles together as the same thing, then what if we take the history on? If he's wrong, they'll start to clash and it just won't work. So what I've done here is look at about 40 years after the two battles. The one that we know was in 605 BC, so we're coming down to sort of 550 BC. And then all this Egyptian and Hittite stuff, which has been pulled down hundreds of years. Do they still fit? If they don't, then we can more or less forget about it. If they do fit, then there might be something to say that Veliokovsky had something in his theory. Egyptian and Hittite history in the time of Ramesses II is inextricably linked. There isn't any argument. No historian would question the fact that during the years that Ramesses lived and down to his son Merneptah, that these Hittite kings existed at the same time, very closely linked. The Battle of Kadesh is described as Ramesses' year 5 in detail in the Egyptian history. His adversary, Muwatallis II, there are no direct Hittite texts that record the battle, but they do say that the Hittites beat the Egyptians. So there's something that lines up. But then, as the years go on, the interface between Egypt and Hatti, or the Hittites, is very detailed. There was a peace treaty, and we have an Egyptian version of that and a Hittite version as well. Pretty good word for word. One hieroglyphics, the other one in cuneiform. And eventually, the Hittites and the Egyptians got so peaceful with one another, there was actually a marriage as well. Ramesses married the daughter of this guy, Hattusilis. Where I want to take it now is down from the Battle of Kadesh and look at the next generation. Hattusilis, who was the brother of Muwatallis, so there's a single generation down there, was replaced by his son and then grandson, Tudkalius and Suppiluliumus. Ramesses, eventually, having reigned for decades and decades, was replaced by his son Merneptah, who was actually his 13th son. The first 12 had all died by the time Ramesses died. And it's this era that I want to look at. These guys, because of the longevity of their fathers, are all in their 50s when they come to the throne. They're not young chaps at all, but they did get involved in quite a bit of international campaigns. So what I'm trying to do in this test is say, if this is right, that these guys were something to do with the Battle of Carchemish, then these guys, 40 years on, they must be something to do with 550 or around that BC. Because what we're doing with this history is comparing it with Babylonian history. The Babylonians by this time were the main force in the Middle East. The Assyrians had been defeated, and the Babylonian history is the main history we have of this period. So all that Egyptian and Hittite stuff is coming down, because of the battle, coming down 600 years and being put next to this. And so what I'm going to do is look and see, does it clash, or is there some chance that it might fit together? Babylonian history in this period, Battle of Carchemish, 605 BC. Nebuchadnezzar is spoken of as the victor there. He wasn't actually king of Babylon at that time. His father was still alive, but later in 605 his father died. Nebuchadnezzar became king of Babylon and had a very long reign of 40 odd years, replaced very briefly by his son, who didn't last long at all, a couple of years. And then another old guy comes along, Nergal-Isar, again a chap who'd been around quite a bit before this as a businessman. Again, a guy in his 50s when he came to the throne. He didn't last very long. He died in 556 BC. His son came to the throne for a few months, and they quickly got rid of him. And another old guy called Nabonidus took over. So what I'm going to do is look at this period, about 40, 50 years after the Battle of Carchemish, and compare it with Egyptian and Hittite history 40, 50 years after the Battle of Kadesh. As I said, this ought to be a good test. If the two histories clash, then we can more or less forget about Veliokovsky's ideas on this. If they start to merge together, then it would give some credence to what Veliokovsky was arguing. So that's a sort of introduction to the thing. What I want to do now is take you through Egyptian and Hittite history and tell you what happened, and then we'll look at Babylonian history and see what happened there and see if there are any similarities. Towards the end of the reign of Hattusilis III, the Hittite king, there started to get quite a bit of trouble with merchants from Cilicia. This is the southern coastal part of Anatolia. And it appears that the merchants of a town called Ura were traveling into North Syria and really getting a bit too involved in a town called Ugarit. Ugarit was one of the main ports, and I think the merchants of Ura were sort of trying to muscle in on all that trade. Northern Syria always had a great deal of trade with the Mediterranean and then further inland. And Hattusilis decided he had to do something about this. So he publishes this edict. He got this complaint from the king of Ugarit about these merchants, and he publishes this edict that says, look, they've got to go home for the winter. I'm going to curtail what they're doing here. They're not allowed to buy real estate, and they're not allowed to be there for more than 6 months. So he was really going quite hard on them and favouring the much larger, much lucrative port of Ugarit. The trouble is that this started to brew a certain amount of ill feeling, and eventually, not in the time of Hattusilis, but his son inherited the consequences of some of this, and the Cilicians revolted. This is early in the reign of the Hittite king, excuse me, Tudkalius IV, and he just had to get himself involved in southern Anatolia. It was nominally an area that he ruled anyway, and so he had to get involved and put down the revolt by the Cilicians. Not only was there problems within Cilicia, Cyprus, the island just off the coast, was also being threatened as part of the revolt. And we have a text which says the king of Cyprus appealed to his friend, the king of Ugarit, just across in northern Syria. But the king of Ugarit replies and says, sorry, I can't do anything about it. All my fleet is helping the Hittite king anyway to quell the revolt. Eventually, though, the Hittite king, having put down the revolt in Cilicia, actually invaded Cyprus as well to sort things out there. There are two phases to the problems with this Cilician revolt. Tudkalius appears to have sorted things out, but then 2 or 3 years later, all sorts of problems break out again, and the Cilicians again are the cause of the problem. And Ugarit is a wonderful source of clay tablets, and there are 3 tablets found which are contemporary with one another, where commanders are reporting to the Ugarit king about problems with the Cilicians. First, the commander in eastern Cilicia says that he's fortifying a town. He expects an imminent attack. Another guy a little closer in the Amanus Mountains north of Ugarit says that don't worry to the king, I've still got 1,000 horses, and historians think that means 2,000 horses, which means 1,000 chariots. So he's saying, look, I've still got troops here to counter the attack. And then south of Ugarit, another of the generals is expecting a seaborne attack. So he's got chariots drawn up on the shore, and he's also worrying that if they land further south, can I make sure I stop them there? So one revolt is quelled. A few years later, it all starts up again, and the Cilicians are threatening northern Syria once more. Just to put a little bit of picture on this, this is what we now call Turkey, Anatolia. Town of Ugarit is here. Eura, where some of the problems started, is up around the coast there, and obviously you can see Cyprus. The orange lines just show the activity of the Hittite king coming south to first to sort out the problem in Cilicia, this area here, and eventually having to get to Cyprus as well to get the rebels who had been driven from Cilicia had attacked Cyprus. And as we saw from the Ugarit text, at one time the Ugarit fleet was off the coast of Lycia to help the Hittite king, and then in the second phase they're worried about trouble up here in Cilicia and the Amanus region around here, and also south of Ugarit. And in the Hittite history of this time, not much else happens but this activity. I haven't picked this one out as one issue. This is the main thing that happens in the time of these Hittite kings. All the problem appears to be in this area of Cilicia. One last issue that happened because the Hittites eventually were successful and quelled these two rebellions, it clearly drove a lot of the Cilicians abroad. And they end up in what the Greeks would have called Cyrene in Libya. And the Egyptian pharaoh has to repel an attack from Libya. And he talks of fighting the Libyans, who were helped by what he calls northerners coming from all lands. And he lists the different groups of these northerners. One or two names are well known. Luca is the common name for Lycia in several languages. And the Sardan, or Sherdan, as they're sometimes called, had been around for a long time. They come from Western Anatolia. So at least two of these groups are coming from the Anatolia, where all the problems had been. Probably means the others did as well. One of the things that crops up at one time, historians used to suggest that these Akawasha, who were the leaders of these invaders, were Achaeans, the Homeric name for the Greeks. But quite a long time ago now, that was, you do occasionally see that still suggested, but it is extremely unlikely. The Egyptians were great at carving pictures of all their battles and things like that, and they had a rather macabre way of counting the casualties on the enemy's side. They used to cut off their private parts and stack them up, and there is a picture of the pile of you know what. Very useful for historians, because that's where the unlikely comes from. The Akawasha and these others were circumcised, and Greeks never were. So the Achaean angle really isn't on. And given that the Luca and Sheridan certainly came from Anatolia, we'd expect the others to come from the same place. And finally, to cover this side of history, what we found was that after the battles, I think there was an attempt to try and placate those who were still left in Cilicia. Obviously, a lot of the rebels escaped, but the Hittite king particularly was very keen to get grain and supplies into Cilicia, and we have a couple of reports. One, the Egyptian king sent grain, as he says, to keep alive the land of Hatti. And there's also a text which talks of the Hittite king asking for 450 tons of grain to be sent to Ura from the Amak Plain, which is the hinterland of Ugarit, for not just for Ura, but for a place called PDS. We'll come across PDS later on. So, to summarize the history as it comes from Egyptian and Hittite sources in this period, all the problems are in Cilicia. Appear to be two phases of problems that needed to be sorted out, and the rebels also ended up, some of them, attacking Egypt. So that's one side of the story. What I want to do now is say, well, that's what Hittite and Egyptian history says was happening 40 years after Kadesh. What was actually happening around 550 BC? We have some very good information on the two major kings that replaced Nebuchadnezzar. There's a whole series of what's called Babylonian Chronicles, written probably around the time or soon after, which record events. And there were two major events in this period. And in fact, these events are the only ones recorded for the Babylonian kings in terms of any sort of military campaign. In 557 BC, Nergalissar campaigned in Cilicia towards the border of Lydia. And a few years later, in each of 553, 554, and 553 BC, the next king, Nabonidus, also campaigned in Cilicia and northern Syria. You will notice that that's a slightly remarkable coincidence. Babylonian Chronicle number 6 tells us in detail about Nergalissar and his campaign. Just a single campaign. The text says, Apuashu, the king of Perindu, which is Babylonian for Cilicia, mustered his large army and set out to plunder and sack Syria. So the Cilicians under Apuashu were attempting to attack northern Syria. Nergalissar mustered his army and marched to Hume, which is eastern Cilicia, to oppose him. Nergalissar reached them, he inflicted a defeat upon them, seized Ura, which is said to be the home city of this Apuashu, and sacked it. And he then moved inland and sacked another city called Kershi. And then a final text from this campaign says, Petusu, a mountain which is in the midst of the sea, midst of the ocean, and 6,000 combat troops who were stationed in it, he captured by means of boats. So the Babylonian king must have commandeered ships locally, because the Babylonians were not seafaring people particularly. But this was a pretty comprehensive attack by Nergalissar into Cilicia to put down the rebellion. And the last pieces of the Babylonian Chronicle, he, Nergalissar, started fires from the pass of Salune to the border of Lydia. The Babylonians moved westward through Anatolia, almost to the border of Lydia. That is a long way from Babylon. But this guy Apuashu escaped. He fled, so he did not capture him. And in the month Adar, the king of Akkad, the king of Babylon, went home. And here, superimposed on the map, is in green, is the itinerary of the Babylonians under Nergalissar. They came from Babylon, which is over here somewhere, into Cilicia, fought a battle with the rebels, and then came to Ura, the center of the rebellion. They also went off to this little island just off the coast, which is usually called Pitiusa. The Babylonian text says Pidusa, same thing, where they captured these 6,000 troops that were on the island. After that, they then sacked Kershi, and then, as we're told, went through the passes towards Lydia. Lydia in the middle of the 6th century BC was quite a powerful state. And I guess the Babylonian king wasn't going to go into Lydia. He was going to go close, but decided it was probably not a good idea. And again, the Babylonians were a long way from home. So you can see from this Babylonian record that there, just like the Hittite record, there was trouble in Cilicia, and both the Hittite and the Babylonian records mention this port of Ura as being the center of a lot of the problem. There are a couple of questions that come up from Nergalissar's campaign. Why were all these troops stationed on Petusa, the island off the coast? The usual conclusion is there's only one reason they'd have moved them there. It was a stepping stone to taking Cyprus. And Apuasha, this leader, escaped, and presumably they fled to Lydia, because the Babylonians had some reason for traveling in that direction, and the text says they didn't catch this guy, so it seems a reasonable conclusion that that he fled to Lydia to get out of the way. And historians generally believe that Croesus, who had just become king of Lydia, was probably behind all this anyway. He was quite a powerful guy, Croesus, and he'd quite quickly in his reign he'd started to expand Lydia and attack the what's called East Greek, the Ionians and Aeolians on the western coast, and it's generally thought that this problem in Cilicia was probably sparked off and supported by Croesus, and that's why this Apuasha would have fled in that direction for safety. Nugalisar only reigned for a few years, and then Nabonidus became king of Babylon, and very early in his reign he also was involved in northern Syria and Cilicia. In his first year he took the Babylonian army to eastern Cilicia. In the next year he was in Hamath, which is south of Ugarit in northern Syria, and in the third year it says he was in the Amanus Mountains, which again is back north of Ugarit. Those of you who have been watching very carefully will notice that these three places are exactly where the Ugarit texts say there were problems. The other very interesting thing that Nabonidus says in a separate text, the forces that were involved in his campaign were the people of Akkad and Hattiland. He actually says there were Babylonians and Hittites combined against the rebellion. So if we look at what Nabonidus was doing, these light green lines show his campaigns in 3 consecutive years, and as I said, those 3 campaigns tie up exactly with the same places that the Ugaritians were stationing soldiers to repel the rebellion. So there are comparisons between the two texts. In the Hittite text we have rebellion in southern Anatolia, particularly involving Ura and PDS, which presumably is the same as Pitusa. Cyprus was threatened in both cases, and there were threats in the second phase. There were threats to the south and north of Ugarit, in Hamath and the Amanus. So we've looked at the two histories, and there's quite a bit of similarity between them. Our test, I think, is showing that it is quite possible that Veliokovsky's massive movement of Hittite and Egyptian history could actually have happened. You know, it could actually be a correct theory. The test has thrown up a lot of comparisons. But there is one gem. Looking at putting the two histories together, we can probably explain now where each of these 5 groups were, which eventually were driven out of Anatolia and invaded Egypt. We always said, we know the Lycians, no one would argue with that, and the Sheridan are mentioned in various places as coming from western Anatolia. Sardan, Sheridan could come from the capital of Lydia, which is called Sardis. Teresh probably means Tarsus, because Tarsus, if you notice, is right in the middle of all this, and had a bit of a reputation in the previous century as a rebel place. Shekelesh, in fact, Veliokovsky picked this one up. On the map, there is a place called Sagalassos, which is on the edge of Lydia, and that seems to fit quite well. But the remarkable thing is, have you noticed, the leader, according to the Egyptian record, was Akawasha. The leader, according to the Babylonian record, was Apuwasha. The names are very similar. In fact, there are examples of a Semitic name, like Apuwasha, losing the P and gaining a K when written in Hittite or Egyptian. So that is a very close, rather surprising correlation that in all this revolt and in Cilicia, the lead in each case has an incredibly similar name. But there's more. In the Hittite capital Hattusis, on the plateau in Anatolia, there's a text, quite detailed text, called the Milawata Letter. It's written by a Hittite king to another ruler in western Anatolia. The recipient is not named. In fact, the Hittite king isn't named, but looking at the details, historians believe it was written by Tudkalias IV, the first Hittite king who got involved in clearing the rebellion. In the text, the Milawata Letter, it talks about the Western Anatolian king having attacked Milawata, which just about everybody realizes is Miletus. It's described in the right place. Miletus was an Ionian port on the western coast of Anatolia. But this guy, this ruler in the west, had also been involved in a place called Widlusa, which is generally agreed to be the same as the Hittite, as the Greek Ilios, which originally was Wilios. So this guy that Tudkalias writes to is undoubtedly based in western Anatolia. He has attacked the areas both north and south at Miletus and Troy. So there's a very big question here. Was this recipient Croesus? If we're putting the two histories together, there certainly was a very important king in western Anatolia, Croesus, king of Lydia. We know he attacked the Ionians and Aeolians. Herodotus tells us that Croesus very rapidly expanded his influence over western Anatolia. And in the Milawata Letter, the king had clearly only recently succeeded his father, and Croesus succeeded his father in 560 BC, which, remember, we were looking at things in 557 or thereabouts. So it's feasible that the recipient of this Milawata Letter was Croesus, if we're putting the two histories together. But the remarkable thing about the Milawata Letter is it's really all about extradition. The Hittite king requests the return of a fugitive named Agapurusia. Remember, the Babylonian history suggests that someone called Apuwashu was a fugitive in Lydia. And now we have, for the third time, a very similar name. So we put the two histories together, and we find that we've already seen that Akawasha and Apuwasha appear in each one as the leader of the Cilician rebellion. The actual Babylonian history of 550 BC suggests very strongly that Apuwasha escaped to Lydia, and now in the Hittite records, normally 650 years earlier, they're talking about a fugitive and trying to get him extradited with a name which, actually is extremely similar to this one. When you think one's written in Hittite and another's written in Akkadian. So not only have we seen general comparisons and similarities, once you get to this guy's name, there are some very specific similarities between the two histories. So to conclude, there are several similarities between the histories 40 years on, and there's one more to finish. A few years later, according to the Hittite history, in the reign of Suppiluliuma II, the Hittite capital Hattusis was destroyed, and that is the end of the Hittite Empire. The capital never recovered from that destruction. In 547 BC, Croesus attacked and destroyed what Herodotus calls Pateria, but everybody that looks at the site that Herodotus describes, it's exactly where the Hittite capital was. So besides the earlier correlations, we actually have a correlation of the end coming just afterwards. Now, none of this is 100% or anything like that, but this is the way revisionism is in ancient history. You have to look for correlations. And I'm very keen that any theory is tested as hard as possible. And I'm inclined to think Veliokovsky's theory stood up to this test. He never looked in detail at this period, 40 years after Kadesh. But when we do, there's a remarkable tie-up. Yeah. And that's it. Certainly. Well, it depends on the question.
Ugarit, I thought, was destroyed in about 1150 BC. So does it appear in the later history or not?
No. The history, the Hittite Egyptian history, Ramesses II and all that, dated normally to about 1270. Yeah. And then Ugarit disappears about the same time as Hattusis is destroyed. Yes. Of course, if you move it all down, Ugarit has to exist in the 600s. It
hasn't been excavated?
It has been excavated. Too big to discuss here, but I have gone through all the archaeology. There are a lot of things that fit. The most remarkable thing about Ugarit, which Veliokovsky picked up, is its texts. Many of those I quoted there are all written in an alphabetic script, which is exactly this. Well, it's a slight development of the first millennium Hebrew script. It has the same 22 characters as Hebrew, plus a few extras for more specific signs. Ugarit, on that alone, is a total anomaly. Historians say that the Ugaritian alphabet, and there's hundreds of texts written in it, it completely died out and got reinvented 300-400 years later by the Phoenicians, and the Hebrews picked it up as well, and it grew again. There is no link between the two. The funny thing is, it is one of only two alphabetic scripts written in cuneiform. The other one is Persian from 500 BC. So Ugarit is a massive anomaly. In fact, it's the greatest anomaly in all of ancient history, because it's just daft, isn't it? Yeah.
There is a problem with Ugarit, because it was destroyed in a Schaefer earthquake.
Schaefer suggested it was.
And Veliokovsky, in his Ages and Chaos, dated nearer 700 BC than 600.
Yeah. He-
So you're definitely not
he-
using
well,
Veliokovsky's data.
He did, but he hadn't thought it through, because Ugarit, as you've seen briefly from this, is inextricably linked to Hittite history. There are loads of texts exchanged between the Hittite king and the Ugaritian king. So Veliokovsky was putting Hittite history into this period, 550, whatever. He really made a very simple mistake that Ugaritian history has to go there as well. You're right, he did look at Ugarit falling a little earlier. It contradicted himself. Because there's a whole... There are three large corpuses of texts in ancient history. One is Amarna. We all know about the 300-odd texts in Egypt from the Amarna period. The other two major corpuses of texts are the Hittite texts from Hattusis on the plateau in Anatolia, and the Ugaritian texts. And there's hundreds of both of them. And Ugarit was part of the Hittite Empire, and the contacts are many. There is no way of separating Ugarit from the rest of Hittite history.
Who did Croesus think he was attacking on the former site of the Hittite capital?
Well, we don't know. Historians would tell you Phrygians, because Phrygia had been around for some time, Midas and all that in the previous century. Herodotus calls them Syrians, which is a bit of a strange name, but one or two people have pointed out that, well, the Hittites were as much Syrians as Anatolians, because they always, or most of the time, ruled northern Syria and lived there. So Syrians isn't a bad name for Hittites. Yeah, it's just a coincidence that I've looked in detail at the archaeology, and it fits quite well with the Hittite history coming down quite a long way, because there is, they say, there's at least a 500-year gap. Although famously the archaeologist at Bittel, wasn't it? He pointed out that he couldn't find any evidence of a gap in the archaeology. But then again, that's exactly the same at Hisarlik with Troy, isn't it? With 400 years where nothing happened, except after the 400-year gap, they made the same pottery as they did 400 years earlier. Yeah. There are dark ages all over the place, which keep us as amateur historians going. I think this is just the problem we all have, isn't it? That you can find these correlations, you can try to match things together, but none of us has got to a point where it all fits nicely.
If it had been like that,
If it did, we wouldn't be bothering now, would we? Okay, right. Well, one way or another, we seem to have got to about where we should be.